as I started to say, one of my interests is the history of science and the people that um, made it happen. And uh, about um, about 20 years ago, I was working at UNH, and I went into the UNH bookstore, and there was a bookcase that had some books from some of the teachers that were written by the teachers. And one of those teachers is Paul Nyan. He was the head of the electrical engineering department. And so I picked up one of his books, bought it. It happened, the name of it was An Imaginary Tale, The History of the Square Root of -1. So I read that book, and he's such a great author. He makes everything interesting. And so I started reading some more of his books. At the end of this slideshow, I have a list of all the books that he's written. It's about 20 of them. And anyway, to get to this, at some point, I ran across a book that he wrote on Oliver Heaviside, and never really knew much about him. I think some of you have taken, I think it's on a general test. There was one of the questions is about the Heaviside layer. But don't remember that. Okay. All right. So obviously he's not as well known as a lot of people. And so I got the book and I read it. A lot of it is very detailed. Paul Nyan spent about 7 years researching the book, traveled over to England to read a lot of the papers that Heaviside wrote. And it's quite a guy. So I thought I would introduce you a little bit to him. So like I said, his name isn't on everybody's lips. Most people probably don't even know who he is. I think people who've taken electrical engineering, I'm sure they've heard of him. But his achievements overshadowed many of the people that are better known. So this is the guy. He was born in 1850 and he died in 1925. He lived in England, Scotland to be precise. He was pretty much self-taught as a mathematician and physicist. He was born right in the middle of Victorian times at a low socioeconomic level. He didn't go to school past age 16. Eventually, he became accepted as one of the finest scientific minds of the day. He lived pretty much as a recluse among his relatives. And he quit his only job when he was 24 years old. But he spent the next 35 years doing first-rate scientific research. He published technical papers and carried on some real interesting correspondence. That's another thing that I found very interesting about him. He wasn't the kind of guy you actually wanted to run into. Paul Nyan said after he wrote the book, he said it wasn't exactly somebody you wanted to be friends with. His only continuing contacts with women were limited to his mother and nieces and housekeepers. He liked money, but he didn't really want to work for it. And his family and friends pretty much supported him for most of his life, but they paid his bills, even though a lot of times he insulted them. So like like Paul Nahn says, he had rather rough edges. He was uncivil, insensitive, boorish, but he was a first-rank mathematician and physicist. And he had a lot of insight into electrical concepts. He was very funny in print. What he would do is which I'll get into in a minute, he had this long-running feud with somebody who was in the head of um, the, the post office. And the post office, the head of the post office was also in charge of all of the telegraph and eventually the telephone company. And what he would do is he would write papers, and he would, in these papers, these technical papers, he would have digs at some of these people that he didn't like. All right. Like I said, he came from a lower class, and the lower classes in England at that time consisted of three categories. One was what they called the dregs of humanity, then the merely poor, and the craftsmen. Now, the Heaviside family was part of the merely poor. For the first 13 years of his life, they pretty much lived in a slum, and the slums back then were slums. They didn't have running water. They didn't have. It was an open sewer. So Heaviside suffered from pronounced deafness that he got through scarlet fever, which bothered him for most of his life. He was the youngest of four brothers. Thomas, his father, was very brutal, and he beat his kids. But Oliver was the youngest of the four brothers, so he got the least amount of that. His father was a wood engraver, and after 1839, he found it hard to find work because photography started coming into existence. Rachel was Oliver's mother, and she opened a private school for girls in 1855. Oliver, she put Oliver in that school, and when she first put him into the girls' school, since he was the only guy, he didn't want to go to this school, so they took him to the public school where the boys were. And since Oliver was kind of skinny and short, he was 5'4". He decided he didn't want to be among all the bullies, so he went back to the girls' school. But he was a good student, and in 1965 or in 1865, he placed 5th out of 538 on the college preceptor's exams. And at age 16, he left school to study on his own. He learned Morse code. And at that time, the telegraph was already in existence. Charles Wheatstone, most of you have heard of him, I'm sure, the Wheatstone Bridge. He was an electrical scientist, and Oliver was lucky that Charles Wheatstone was his uncle through marriage. Charles Wheatstone was married to Oliver's mother, and not Oliver's mother, Oliver's mother's sister. So, Charles Wheatstone kind of took him under his wing, and this is where he managed to get a lot of the additional education. By the way, the Wheatstone Bridge was not invented by Charles Wheatstone, but he improved it, and for some reason or other, his name stuck to it, even though he would tell people regularly that he wasn't the inventor. Um, with Charles Wheatstone's help, Oliver got a job in Denmark as a telegraph operator. One of the reasons he got the telegraph operator's job is because he also learned that language, the Danish language. While he was working at the telegraph job, he noticed it was the first undersea cable between Denmark and England, and the cable was 347 nautical miles. And Oliver noted that the transmission time for signals were different going in one direction and the other direction. Said they were 40% faster going from England to Denmark than going the other way. At that time, the telegraph cable theory was defined by William Thomson, who was later known as Lord Kelvin. And this theory used the math, which was the same kind of math that they used for heat flow, which basically that's what they used to define the flow of electricity through a cable. But Heaviside figured out that it was actually a wave propagation theory, which is what accounted for the difference. Said Thomson's theory was adequate for long and low signal rate cables that were dominated by capacitance. Those were the undersea cables. The cables that went over land between telephone poles or telegraph poles, those were induction dominated. And what happened was that the high frequencies in speech and also as the rate of signals, the telegraph signals, the higher speed that they used for those, what would happen is they would kind of, over the longer distance, they would pile on top of each other and they became unintelligible. So Heaviside was responsible for figuring out how to compensate for that. And essentially what they did was they added some inductance every so often in these undersea cables. Now the undersea cables, the original undersea cables used, there was a conductor and the rest of it was a rubber insulator, and they used seawater as the return path. So this same insight that Oliver had with the telegraph cables eventually also made the voice communication possible. In 1870, these telegraph services in England were transferred to the monopoly of the British Post Office. And William Henry Preece, he was the chief engineer of the British Post Office. He was very powerful. He didn't know much about math, but he as Paul Nodden says, he was a blockhead. And he was the one that eventually Oliver wound up having a feud which lasted pretty much a lifetime. So Priest, he had little analytical insight to the nature of electricity, but he considered it similar to an incompressible fluid in a pipe. Um, and Oliver Lodge called this the drain pipe theory. But the mathematical complexity of Maxwell's field theory, or even just the AC circuit theory, he didn't understand that. So in 1890, when it was clear that he was wrong, he started this, he still refused to believe it. And most of his feud with Heaviside circled around that. Now, these are probably the three people that were most influential in this story. The top one on the left is Maxwell. Then we have Priest on the bottom and Heaviside. And I tried to give a little indication of how their lives overlapped. The left bar is Maxwell, the middle one is Priest, and the blue one is Heaviside. In 1873, Heaviside submitted a technical paper that used differential calculus on electrical matters to several magazines. One of those magazines was called The Electrician. And he had correspondence with both Thomson and Maxwell. Maxwell's treaty in 1873, which was called the Treatise on Electricity and Magnetism, when Heaviside got his hands on that, it changed his whole life. He couldn't put it down, and he wanted to know all about it. He quit his only job, and he went to live with his parents. Now, his parents managed to, I mean, they never became wealthy, but they did move up in the world, and both his brothers and his parents were off well enough to support Oliver, which he took advantage of. Yeah. So doing his research from home, he showed mathematically that the uniformly distributed inductance in a telegraph line would diminish both attenuation and distortion. It's what I talked about earlier, about adding inductance. He had regular articles in a trade magazine, The Electrician, and he got paid a little bit for that. Most people didn't pay any attention to him at that time, even though he had all these articles. And within these articles, he would have little back and forth with Priest. He researched the skin effect in telegraph transmission lines. And essentially what the skin effect is, the higher the frequency that goes through a cable or through a line, through a conductor, most of the current starts to flow towards the outside of the cable, towards the periphery of the cable. So he did some research along those lines. And he pretty much invented the coaxial cable, for which he received a patent in England. But this is Maxwell's equations, and I just wanted to put this one slide up to kind of give you an indication. When Maxwell first came up with his equations, where he related electricity and magnetism and showed that they were created the electromagnetic waves, which we know as light and also his radio waves. Maxwell's equations, there were 20 of them, and they were kind of difficult to understand. At some point, these equations were translated into what we call quaternions, which is really some vector notation that that deals with rotation. And for a long time, they used quaternions to express Maxwell's equations. Now, Heaviside took Maxwell's equations, and what he did was he rewrote them in vector notation. He also discovered that there were some of Maxwell's equations that that they were cumbersome to understand, and Maxwell used potentials within his equations, and Heaviside determined that you didn't need to do that. So they were reduced down to 12, and after Heaviside got done, he wound up with 4 equations. And these are the 4 equations that we use now that we call Maxwell's equations.
And it's a good thing because now they fit on a t-shirt.
Yes, yes. You need a bigger shirt with the other ones. Okay. Between 1880 and 1887, Heaviside developed and used what he called operators. And these were essentially, the operators were, he would take a differential equation and he would replace some component of a differential equation with what he determined was an operator, and which reduced the differential equation down to an algebraic equation, and you could which made it easier to solve. And at the end, then you translated it back using the operator to get the answer. So in our modern way of doing this, we use Laplace transforms, which is essentially a similar thing, for those of you who know Laplace transforms. Heaviside's operational calculus received a lot of criticism from some of the mathematicians because he didn't really try to prove that they worked in every instance. They worked for electrical problems, but they didn't always work for some other things. But they were good enough for what he wanted to do. And his operators were used up into the 1940s to solve some of these electrical problems. But as far as 1960 and sometime between 1940 and 1960, textbooks started to use the Laplace transforms instead. Okay, in 1902, Marconi demonstrated that a radio signal could cross the Atlantic. At that time, people didn't understand how that could happen because they assumed that radio signals went in a straight line. And so there was something caused them to go around the curve. So Heaviside proposed that there was a reflective ionizing layer, which we now call the ionosphere. And he was the one that did some of the math to prove how this would work. And the ionosphere wasn't confirmed until 1923. So he was way ahead of his time. And the Heaviside layer, which is the E layer that we refer to. It's that the importance of the Heaviside layer remained undiscovered for some time after the publication of the Electrician. That's because a lot of people didn't pay any attention to it. A lot of people didn't understand it. In 1897, AT&T got some of his, got an employee of theirs and also a contractor to start looking at some of these articles that Heaviside had written in the Electrician. And they tried to find something in his article that, or in his work, that was either incomplete or wasn't right. And what they did was they extended his work so they could patent it. Since they added a little something to it, that gave them the right to patent it. He never tried to patent anything other than the coaxial cable. Some of the engineers at AT&T did decide that maybe this wasn't quite fair, and they decided that they would give him credit for some of it and pay him a small amount. But he refused it because he said if they weren't going to give him credit for the whole thing, he didn't want any part of it. In 1891, the British Royal Society recognized his contributions and in electromagnetic phenomena, and they named him a fellow of the Royal Society, which is a big deal. And the following year, they devoted more than 50 pages to his vector methods and his electromagnetic theory. In 1905, he was given an honorary doctorate by the University of Göttingen. And another thing was he didn't believe in Einstein's theory of relativity, and he was one of the few scientists who was outspoken about it. He became a recluse later in his life. He was so adverse to meeting people that he would deliver his manuscripts to the local grocery store where the editors would pick it up. In 1922, he became the first recipient of the Faraday Medal. And that was actually the first year when that medal was introduced. In February of 1925, he fell from a ladder and died. So, could be. Yeah. So I hope this made you want to look a little bit more into his life, and there's a lot more to it. He was a very interesting person. Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Oh, wait,
Yep.
I wanted to, this is the book that I have, and this, I can send this whole thing out. It's just a PDF. And on the right-hand side of this, all the books that Paul Nine has written. One of the books that he wrote, which some of you may be interested in, is called The Science of Radio. But it's very technical.
Very good.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.